Hello and welcome to NBC Current Affairs this Tuesday. I'm Jerry Tave, glad to have your company. Tonight on NBC Current Affairs, we speak with Paul Barker. He's the director of the Institute of National Affairs, an independent non-profit research institute. Now, tonight we discuss more on the consequences of PNG being placed last month on the Financial Action Task Force grey list. Now, this status subjects PNG to increased monitoring. Mr. Barker is our guest tonight, and he'll talk more on this issue. Stay tuned. Mr. Barker, welcome to NBC Current Affairs.
Thanks, Jerry.
Now, Papua New Guinea, as you know, you're quite aware of, has been placed recently, last month it was, grey listed by the Financial Action Task Force. Now, just for the benefit of our viewers and just in layman's term, can you explain to us what that means for the country?
Okay, thank you. The Financial Action Task Force, or often called FATF, is an institution that was set up particularly by the developed countries that are members of the OECD. So that's a club of developed economies, but it was designed to protect the global financial system from potential abuse that might jeopardize its functioning. And so it was particularly, they were concerned about money laundering, money being used for illicit purposes, for trafficking of goods, for drugs, but just money which may be sometimes government money getting diverted into private people's bank accounts and then transferred to real estate in New York, London, Paris. So it was basically to try and set up systems to protect the integrity of the financial system, because as you know, if you are dealing with money, it's all based on trust. And if you start abusing that trust, then all kinds of illegal transactions can be occurring, and money can be diverted, which can be public money or a different country's money, and diverted using the formal channels. So it's to try and make sure that the formal channels are only going to be used for legitimate transactions. Now, we know there are other ways of smuggling that happen, and those are for other entities that need to work with the other authorities to make sure, that's drug smuggling, illegal logging transactions and other resources, and so on. So it's part of the global system for trying to improve transparency and accountability and to make sure that there's the integrity of the financial systems.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barker. Now, in terms of advantages, it's not all doom and gloom. What are, just probably you can highlight some of the pros and cons of being grey listed?
Okay, well, there are not a lot of pros, but as I say, you can be grey listed or you can be blacklisted. And so blacklisted means that you're basically shut out of the global financial system. And so the commercial banks, the registered commercial banks around the world, won't be trading with your money. Grey listed is more like a warning. You're on the watch list. So they're wanting to make sure that you are complying, your systems are in place. And we did go on the grey list before in 2014 to 2016. And that was when we had none of the relevant laws in place to safeguard against money laundering or unexplained wealth and other such concerns. So since then, we got off the grey listing in 2014-16 by committing to introducing a range of legislation, which over the next few years we did. Anti-money laundering legislation, introduced the Anti-Corruption Commission, ICAC, and laws to protect against, for example, unexplained wealth. How come you have large amounts of money that is way in excess of what your salary as a departmental head or a minister could possibly be? So all those sorts of pieces of legislation, a whole series of them have been brought into place, including legislation for more effective monitoring of financial transactions. So under that, the FASU was established for monitoring. So your question, the pros and the cons, yes, we almost knew, well, we virtually knew that we were going to go on the grey list because there's a systematic checklist of things that we have to have done. And they did find that we'd done quite a number of those things quite well. And that includes setting up a FASU and quite effective monitoring. And the banks have all substantially increased their staffing for internal oversight. So they may have had 2 or 3 staff, now have 60 or 70 staff. So they're monitoring, and so we got credibility for establishing that. Where we failed to get the credibility was on the implementation side in terms of prosecutions, and one has to have had a track record of several years of actual prosecutions. And of course, the police had a limited capability and maybe limited inclination. They say they did do some prosecutions, but we didn't have the track record and demonstrated track record to show to FATF that we were pursuing these prosecutions. ICAC has obviously only just been established, so they also have only had a short period in which to demonstrate. So we knew we were going to go on to the grey list, and as I say, the government had already established its task force, bringing together 23 government agencies, and as I say, working with the commercial banks, the financial institutions. So there's a lot of work has been done, and those banks in turn have been engaging with their correspondent banks overseas, so that the banks overseas are not going to be in a panic about PNG going into the grey list, so that they're aware. The pros and cons, the cons are, well, yes, it is already, by strengthening the systems, slows transactions down a bit because you have to do more paperwork. New forms were introduced and have to be filled in. It takes a bit longer. Fortunately, it coincides with this actually having more foreign exchange. So transactions have sped up lately because the forex shortage has not been so short. So that side has sped things on, but the paperwork has increased, and sometimes people have realized that, instead of in the past it was just forms for sending money out, but no one was ever checking money coming in. Now there are checks, and sometimes the inflows are also subject to more scrutiny and sometimes even rejection. So that was already in place. It will, over the next period of time, probably be more rigid, but a lot of it was already in place. But there will be greater scrutiny. The established banks have really got the systems functioning. They'll probably go on being streamlined. Some of the new banks obviously have to establish their mechanisms to establish credibility for international transactions. Some of them are probably better established than others. But in terms of the pros and the cons, the pros would be that it is forcing the government and the government institutions to have to set up better systems for coordination and oversight. And as you know, in PNG, one of its issues, the country's issues, is we have hundreds of institutions that tend not to work in very good cooperation with each other. And we need to strengthen the systems for coordination, cooperation, and in the financial sector, that includes financial management. And we know there are a lot of concerns over transactions going to the provinces, going to district grants, going to some of the state-owned enterprises. And hopefully the result of this system of greater scrutiny and greater enforcement by the police, by ICAC, working with all those other 23 institutions, which range from the Ombudsman Commission through to the Internal Revenue, Customs, and so on. Hopefully, at the end of the day, we'll actually see greater scrutiny and greater accountability of public funds. And that has to be for the benefit of citizens of the country, because we know a lot of people complain, okay, we got this amount of money came into our district, 10 million per district, or maybe now 20 million per district. And what have we got to show for it? Sometimes it's overpriced goods and services.
We'll go for our first break now. When we come back, we'll continue our talk with Mr. Paul Barker. He's the Director of the Institute of National Affairs. Stay tuned. Welcome back to NBC Current Affairs, and we're continuing our talk with Mr. Paul Barker, is the Director of the Institute of National Affairs, INA. Now, Mr. Barker, before the break, you did speak about prosecution. Why is it an issue, especially enforcement in Papua New Guinea?
Well, from talking earlier on with ICAC, some of the staff in ICAC, they had said when they were trying to recruit investigators, the first place they went was really to the police to try and pinch some experienced investigators from there. And they said, well, there are not that many experienced investigators. We haven't really devoted the resources to the police capacity, and then capacity in other institutions to be doing the investigations. Maybe we let it go slack. We used to have a unit in the Finance Department and Treasury, the Treasury inspectors. I think that they still exist on paper, but they used to do excellent work in investigating potential fraud within the government system and alerting the government to that, even before it came to audits and before it came to prosecutions. We seem to have allowed it to go amiss, and we really do need to have more investment in the capacity to investigate. And we need to partner also with the private sector. So when we've had commissions of inquiry, like the NPF inquiry, you remember at the beginning of the 2000s, we brought in the government, the inquiry brought in from the private sector some forensic auditors to inspect all those books of the National Provident Fund and some legal firms and their books to trace where money was going. But we probably need to have that partnership with skilled forensic auditors in the private sector working together while we build up the capacity in both the police and within ICAC. And the inspectors also, you have to have investigative capacity within Internal Revenue and tax and customs and so on. And I should add, of course, we do know that there's the other side, which is corruption. So there is an incentive, and you'll have people being sometimes rewarded not to investigate. And we know of a number of cases where influential people, well-resourced people, sometimes do either threaten or induce people. And so we know of cases where prosecutions, which would seem to happen not just in money laundering, but in gender-based violence cases and some other cases where it seems that sort of influential people suddenly are let off the loop, and the paperwork has disappeared and they're walking free before the prosecution. So corruption is a factor in there. So you get a lot of good, honest people in the system, but you know that there are bad apples, and certainly when people are powerful, sometimes they abuse their power.
Okay. Now you mentioned about government measures, and part of it is the establishment of ICAC. There are anti-corruption bodies out there. ICAC is one of them. But do you think they're effectively functioning their mandate, especially?
Well, the Ombudsman Commission was a very effective organisation in the early years after independence. You had some very strong independent ombudsmen, chief commissioners, people like Sir Ignatius Kalagi, Dame Jean Kikedo was an ombudsman. You had Charles Mino, these Ilageno, a whole history of very strong people who were formidable and were not going to be sort of intimidated. Phoebe Sangatari later, very impressive. Then it seemed that, somewhere along the line, they seemed to lose a little bit of their momentum. Frankly, some of the pieces of legislation probably needed to be updated and reinforced. For example, you can submit your leadership returns to the Ombudsman and it's discreet. At the time when the Ombudsman was established as an institution under the Constitution, that was very up to date. Nowadays, around the world, one tends to make it even more transparent. So leaders would submit their returns not just to the Ombudsman, but actually table it in the Parliament, and it would be a public document and everyone can see. And that can enhance transparency as well, because you can then see this is the person's income, his assets, and how come these assets are accumulate? And then you can verify, well, hang on, he's driving a Ferrari, but that's not been recorded. So the public can do social accountability. So some countries, like Norway, your tax returns are not private. They're public documents. Anyone can look up. I can look up my next door neighbor. You're my next door neighbor. I can look up your returns and I can see that you say, oh, I haven't made any money this year, and yet you seem to be spending like nobody's business. So I can actually dob you into the tax office and say, I think there's something awry. We have the protective tax laws, so there's a level of discretion. But once you're a leader, you're really meant to be, expected, because you're handling public money from whether it's in a state-owned enterprise or in a straight department or ministry or whatever. So that transparency should be there, and probably we should be moving on. But even so, the Ombudsman Commission, very strong. Police used to take on cases. I know that there's a concern within the police that there's probably not as much communication going on. And that's not just the police, it's a lot of institutions. They withdraw into themselves and they operate as silos, and they don't talk to other parts of their own institution, and they don't cooperate with other institutions. And sort of sometimes they say, well, power is knowledge, but everyone is working for the government, if they're working for the government, that is, and they should be cooperating and coordinating. And civil society, the churches, have an important role in helping keep them accountable, because they are public servants working for the public, so the public requires and expects accountability. But yeah, some of those institutions seem to lose a bit of their drive and momentum. Maybe the current circumstances and going in the grey zone is helping give them some revival, and certainly also helping to facilitate some of the needed coordination that you need for a process like this. And that includes institutions like Lands Department. It includes some of the resource departments and agencies which are managing major public resources, including land, which, as we know, are sometimes some of the transactions that, some of the ways that money is laundered as it gets transferred into land. Another way is the use of entities like casinos, where money can get laundered through a casino, and then you come out and say, oh, I've won all this money in the casino. Well, actually the money was hot money in the first place. So some of those institutions, they do need revival. They do need greater transparency and accountability. We need to strengthen the role of Parliament to demand that the legislature and its institutions are accountable. And that includes bodies like the Public Accounts Committee actually doing what they used to do in the early days after independence, hauling in the departmental heads and even ministers and saying, okay, this is the allocation that's gone to you, and the Auditor General's report says, the money hasn't been fully accounted for, and so asking some strong questions, and if needs be, heads roll if people are not performing. So, yeah, revitalizing those institutions, absolutely critical.
Okay, well said. We'll go for our final break now. When we come back, we'll continue our talk with Mr. Paul Barker, who's the head of the INA. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our final segment. We're continuing our talk with Mr. Paul Barker. He's the director of the Institute of National Affairs. Now, Mr. Barker, grey-listed PNG. There are other issues that PNG might be copying this year. That is to do with the effects of the US, Israel, and Iran, the war that's happening right now. But in terms of the effects that PNG might be feeling, how soon do you think the PNG might be feeling some of the effects of the war that's happening right now?
Well, I suppose the 20th century was a period where everything became globalized. And 21st century, things are instant. We're in the electronic era. Everything happens immediately. So obviously you've had, in the 20th century, you had two global wars. They started locally. In Sarajevo for the First World War, no one would have expected that to have turned into an almost global war. And then just 20 years later or so, there was the Second World War, which became a global war as time went by. You really want to constrain those conflicts, and of course, you don't want the conflicts in the first place. After World War II, all the institutions of the United Nations and other related institutions were established to make sure that we didn't have local conflicts spilling out and becoming bigger conflicts and then global conflicts. And we also set up a load of financial institutions to ensure that we avoided economic catastrophes, and which are often also triggers for conflict. Access to resources, access to fuel, oil. Some people say that the conflicts of the future will be based on access to water and food, of course. So as the 21st century has occurred, everything is so much more instant. So as soon as this conflict started, and there was no real notice for it happening. The last 14 months has been a whole succession of introduction of measures which seem to undermine the global system of law, whether it's the UN and the global and the General Assembly and the Security Council, and also the financial systems like the World Trade Organization. We're seeing suddenly trade being used as a weapon. We're seeing instant invasions and other actions which are not compliant with international law or trade law as we've known them for the last many years. So they were put in place for very good reasons to safeguard and limit the opportunities. We're moving into a more dangerous and hazardous period where the powerful seem to be able to take action spontaneously without consultation with the UN, without the mandate of the UN, without even really building up a force of allies. And we know it has instant repercussions.
Now, do you think this is the right time for PNG, especially the government, to, capitalize on the situation and bring on stream some of the, the oil and LNG resources to supply the market right now?
Well, our existing production is fully committed, and it's being sold to Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore. So to develop a new capacity would obviously take several years and major further investment. We know that major resource projects have been in the pipeline for, as it were, for many years, the Papua LNG, the Png, and there are further potential fields. Obviously, there's also non-oil energy resources, which we could and should be investing in, and that's, includes solar, and it includes hydro, geothermal potentially. PNG is an energy-rich country, both with the mineral energy, as it were, the oil and gas, or the renewable energy sources. So that depends on partnership. So you're talking about, the government is wanting basically the private sectors to do the investment. Yes, we do have the state-owned enterprises, Kumul Petroleum particularly, with some capacity, and some capacity with MRDC, which is doing some of the processing for the domestic market. But the bulk of the capital you would be wanting to be coming from the global market, both in equity, both from the major investors, the major companies, and potentially a level of borrowing. But the state would undoubtedly have to borrow for its equity in that. It can't all happen immediately. They're working through the process at the moment for some of those projects, and we were expecting in the second quarter to hear progress on further announcements. I understand lately that it may have slipped back to the third or the fourth quarter. Maybe the current uncertainty will bring it forward, because clearly if the higher prices are going to remain for an extended period of time, that is an attractive scenario for investors in any energy source, including oil and gas. But it is also because we're nearer to the market, and we, touch wood, have no major conflicts in this region, it obviously is an attractive source for energy for China, for Japan, for Taiwan, for the Southeast Asia, India as well as more locally, even New Zealand, I've been hearing, is wanting to receive LNG. It's a small market, but it's relatively accessible. So there would be a strong incentive, and maybe it will help speed up the processes. But I think uncertainty in the Middle East probably encourages longer term investment in this region, but just the fact that you've got a higher price at the moment wouldn't necessarily in itself encourage, because you don't know what the price will do next week. Sometimes the price has been up to 120, and sometimes the price has been down to $20 a barrel. So yeah, you need level of certainty.
Mr. Barker, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Good to talk to you, Jerry, and your listeners and viewers. Thanks.
And that was Mr. Paul Barker, the director of the Institute of National Affairs, just talking to us about grey list in PNG, as well as the impacts of the US, Israel and Iran war. And that too has been our program for tonight. Until the same time tomorrow night, I'm Jerry Tave. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.